Welcome everyone to our AIB webinar featuring the latest research from the Academies 2 Journal, Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of International Business Policy. My name is Klaus Meyer. I'm a professor of international business at the AIB Business School. I'm your host today. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the people who helped make this happen. In particular, my collaborator in coordinating the webinars, Dana Minbayeva, and of course, our reliable support at the AIB Secretariat, Tunga Kiak and Dan Rosblock. The purpose of our seminars is to provide a forum to discuss the research that happens in the AIB field and to discuss its broader implications as well as directions for what further research is needed. So we are really focused on published papers. We picked 3 papers that have been published in either one of the journals. Actually, today, all 3 papers are from JIBS. And the 3 papers speak to a common overarching question, which today is, how can multinational enterprises from emerging economies catch up with advanced economies and compete in advanced economies? You, as the audience, can actively participate, and we actually strongly encourage you to do so. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions. And our moderator, which today is Yadong Luo, will be able to read those and select from the questions submitted some questions to ask the audience. You, by the way, are also able to vote for questions. And the more votes a question gets, the further it moves up the priority list, which means the moderator is can more easily pick it up. That's a nice feature in Zoom as well. So my co-host today and the moderator of the discussion is Yadong Luo, who I presume most people who are in the audience will know Yadong because he is one of the contributors to the research on the multinational enterprise from emerging economies. You probably know him in particular for this idea of Springboard strategy, which he published 2 papers on in JIBS with Rosalie Lohr, one already a few years ago, one of them in 2017. And today's papers actually build on this idea. So we have 3 young scholars who are trying to stand on his shoulders. Let's see if they are strong enough to stand there or whether they fall down under the questions that we asked. Without further ado, I hand over to Yadong. Please, Yadong, introduce the topic and the speakers. You're muted.
Let me begin by welcoming our global participants. I want to add my thanks to not only our renowned scholars, speakers, but also I really want to take this opportunity to appreciate Klaus, yourself, along with our AIB entire office team for organizing not merely this webinar on emerging market MNEs, but throughout the pandemic and in the past, and even for upcoming the webinar frontier topics. I know, Klaus, I think we are really indebted to you behind the scene, investing so much time, coordination, and even brainstorming. For that, we all are appreciated for your organizing. I have to, I think, also to clarify that all 3 the stellar speakers are not young. They are not young in virtually all senses. And certainly in terms of scholarship and intellectual levels, actually, I think they are on the very frontline IB scholars to really not just promote, but also establish new ideas and new thoughts, new insights on emerging market enterprises. So Klaus, when you asked me to join you for this webinar, and when I saw the list of speakers, it really motivated me, it excited me. I think the topic itself, I do have a mixed feeling. On the one hand, I think the emerging market MNEs have become one of the prominent the domains in IB research over the past, particularly I think over the past 10 to 20 years. So in that sense, we are so lucky, benefiting these opportunities and allowing us to both theorize, but also validate a variety of fascinating issues. For that, we are beneficiaries. But on the other hand, I think when we look at the industry, when we look at the practice, and here and there, China, India, for example, Brazil, those companies have more challenges than we know. These companies have probably a longer list of untackled, unanswered issues than what the JIPs, than what the other major IB journals have addressed. So on the one hand, I think we made our own contributions in publishing our pieces in major IB journals. But every time when I learn new things from the field, I have to be humble, realizing that there are more issues we didn't address enough. But today we are excited that the three speakers who represent not only their teams, but also they are exemplary representing some of the latest cutting edge research. And I probably, if the time permits, I like to share some of the, perhaps the final thoughts in the ending part. And so let me introduce our three stellar speakers today in the following order of presentation. Like Klaus mentioned, all three cutting edge latest research on EM MNEs published in JIPs. So that self speaks quality as well. And our first speaker, Vikas Kumar, who will represent the entire team, including Disha Singh and Anish Pakayatha, and also Manish Papli, and of course, Ajar Gore. And this paper tackles the Springboard internationalization by emerging market firms, I think in a particular empirical context of the Indian firms. And not only, I think the reference into IB, the Springboard theories, but I think they extended this logic quite impressively as well. Professor Vikas, as many of us know well, is a head of international business discipline and also professor of international business at the University of Sydney Business School. He has been dedicated for many years to the global strategy in general, and also internationalization of emerging market firms in particular. So without further ado, the Vikas, please.
Thank you, Yadong. Thank you, Klaus. This is a great opportunity for me and for my team to actually share the paper that we were able to publish in JIBS last year. So Yadong has already actually given the starting bit of what we try to do here, which is mainly to advance the Springboard perspective, which Yadong and Rosalie actually introduced for the first time in 2007. And we try to advance it in the context of India. What is something that is very close to our heart and something that we are very proud about is that it is not only an application in the empirical sense, but we also theoretically apply the context to a large extent in how we develop our hypotheses. So my co-authors are Diksha Singh from Rutgers, Anish Purkayashta from University of Sydney, Manish Pokli from IIM Indore, and Ajay Gaur from Rutgers University. So we advance the Springboard perspective by providing certain contextualized insights. And I'll get into the contextualization after I just quickly mention about what we mean by Springboard internationalization. And this has essentially been taken from Yadong and Rosalie's work in 2007, but also in 2018. So the Springboard internationalization is characterized by asset augmentation instead of asset exploitation, which was quite common when the Western, so-called the typical Western multinationals were internationalizing. Acquisition instead of the greenfield venture in the Springboard internationalization is the main international operating mechanism. Then accelerated, that is fast, instead of incremental internationalization is another characteristic of the Springboard internationalization. And aggressive seeking of strategic assets right from the starting point of foreign direct investment is another characteristic of firms that pursue Springboard internationalization. And all of this are done to improve the company's, the firm's competitiveness, not only globally, but also domestically. So these are some of the very specific traits or characteristics of Springboard internationalization. And we pick up on some of them. We pick up specifically on the aggressive seeking of strategic assets from the outset as something which is probably more interesting in the specific context that we are talking about. And the specific context is that of India, which is one of the largest emerging markets. And we ask ourselves, what are the type of emerging market multinationals in India that are more likely to aggressively internationalize? Because the underlying premise is that even if the Springboard internationalization applies to many emerging market multinationals, it would not apply to all. So how do we advance our understanding? How do we increase the relevance of this study is by actually figuring out what are the specific characteristics of the emerging market firms that are more likely to springboard or aggressively internationalize vis-a-vis others. The theoretical foundation, as you can easily pick up, is the Springboard perspective. The reason why we actually do that is because we find this as being a multi-theoretic or so-called eclectic paradigm, which includes not only the institutional, because this is what the cornerstone of the Springboard is, but it also includes the strategic and resource considerations in explaining firm internationalization. And this we found is particularly important in the context of emerging markets such as India, because there are varying strategic and resource considerations on top of the very unique institutional environment that Indian firms actually face. We contextualize to some extent the notion of aggressive internationalization. In literature, this is coming out from the speed of internationalization literature, where essentially it's the rapidity of entry into different markets which has been treated as aggressive internationalization. When we look into the context of India, what we see is that there are very few firms actually which have internationalized into, say, more than 10 international markets. And what we then realize that the most important and relevant aspect of aggressive internationalization for the Indian context, and that would apply to many other emerging markets as well, is not the rapidity of entry, but actually the time to first entry. And the time to first entry we qualify as the aggressive internationalization. The first entry is captured by cross-border acquisition and not by any other means of entering into the international market. And this is also because we considered CBA, that is cross-border acquisition, and not exports as reflecting the first big step, first big move in the international market. CBAs are extremely risky, and if a firm is able to actually make that CBA into an international market fairly quickly, we consider that as a form of aggressive internationalization. As I mentioned, the research context is India, but not only India, it's India's evolving institutional environment, and we apply that throughout the research in the empirical, but also in the theoretical section of the paper. The empirical setting includes over 8,000 listed Indian firms over a period of 18 years. So some of the major tenets or some of the major theses that we actually posit in this paper are in the form of the hypothesis. And the first one refers to whether firm is young or old. And what our central argument here is that the institutional embeddedness has a huge role to play in how firms would internationalize. In our case, we actually hypothesize that the institutional embeddedness would have a huge role to play in terms of how quickly a firm would be likely to make its first cross-border acquisition. So the way we actually argue is that the older firms are more deeply embedded in the environment, which are characterized by lack of foreign competition and significant non-market-based advantages. The younger firms, which are born and which actually prosper in an era which is more liberalized, where institutions have better developed, are more flexible in transforming their organization and strategy. They're not actually burdened by the dense networks that the older firms are. They have less inertia to look outwards, as domestic positions for these firms are not as strong. And when the time arises, such as when there is a major change in the external institutional environment, these are the firms which are more quick, which are more agile, which are in fact more smart and motivated to execute that first cross-border acquisition faster than the older firms. We go ahead and further contextualize our study, and we incorporate the influence of business group. And this is something which is very difficult to avoid when one is researching on emerging markets and firms from these emerging markets, because this, the business group kind of actually includes close to, I would say, 70%, at least in the case of India, 70% of the businesses. So what we do here is look into how does the affiliation of business groups affect this tendency or likelihood of firms to quickly internationalize through a CBA. Now, we look into the literature and find that affiliation to a business group has a lot of benefits. It provides resources to affiliates to overcome market failure domestically. It provides international market knowledge through the network that it actually owns. It, in a sense, provides a superior performance relative to unaffiliated firms. However, what we actually notice when we apply the Springboard perspective and when we look at the specific issue at hand, which is to find out the tendency to internationalize quickly through CBA, we find that these affiliation benefits would actually not allow these firms to be motivated enough to make that risky move. In fact, it is the unaffiliated firms which would be actually more keen to making this first CBA quicker. The affiliated firms, in fact, as being part of the business group, to some extent have mastered the art of actually working well in this constrained, less liberal environment. And they would be, in that sense, less motivated to go outside, acquire resource, and develop their competitiveness even more. So our hypothesis too relates to the firms which are affiliated to business groups having actually a less likelihood to execute their first CBA faster. So in that sense, the unaffiliated firms are better off. The unaffiliated firms are more likely to execute the first CBA faster than firms affiliated with the business group. We further go deeper into the business group affiliation, and we develop three hypotheses. But this only pertains to firms which are affiliated to the business group. And through these three additional hypotheses, what essentially we are doing is we are contextualizing our research even more. So hypothesis 3 relates to the business group affiliated firms which are young, because even within the business group affiliated firms, we can have both old and young firms. And we find that the younger group affiliated firms are more likely to execute their first CBA faster than other firms. We then delve into the heterogeneity that exists in the business group. And we find that the business group firms which are affiliated to the groups which have a higher group level foreign investment would again be less motivated to make a quick CBA because of all the risks that are involved, because they already have a favored position in their home market. Similarly, the group affiliated firms that are affiliated to groups which have higher group level, overall group level assets are again less likely to execute CBA in search of resources outside. So what you can see here is the pictorial description of our model, where we have firm age reflecting the level of institutional embeddedness and business group affiliation as the key explanatory variable for our Springboard internationalization or aggressive internationalization, which is captured by the speed of first cross-border acquisition. And then we go deeper into the context of business group by looking at how the young business group firms would behave in terms of the speed of first CBA, and then deeper into the business group by looking at the group level foreign investment and the group level assets. So we do find actually support for all our hypotheses when we run the Cox proportional hazard method of the 8,000 listed firms that we have. I'm not going to go into the details of the methodology or the results, but present the research highlights. And I've also alluded to this part where I mentioned that the Indian context here proved to be very useful in enriching the internationalization theory by being able to apply the Springboard perspective. So we have moved beyond just keeping India as a context for the empirical analysis, but also included the institutional change. In our theory making, we included the aspects of business group and helped in advancing and applying the Springboard perspective. We conceptualize the Springboard internationalization, at least one element of the Springboard internationalization, in a way which is more easy to actually understand and in a way which is more easy to capture and test. And that is by actually defining the Springboard phenomena. So we for our purposes in this paper, we say a firm springboards when it pursues a cross-border acquisition quickly. That is, if it takes less time relative to other firms to make its first CBA. So we utilize the cross-border acquisition, which we think is a far more appropriate measure of capturing the internationalization when understanding the Springboard than any other form of internationalization. And finally, we use the business group effect and I would say decipher the heterogeneity that exists by looking at how it affects the Springboard internationalization. So there are a lot of ways in which we can take this research forward. First of all, we should apply, future researchers should apply the Springboard perspective more broadly, not only to other emerging markets, because each emerging market is quite different from the other. For example, India is so different from China, let alone from Russia, Brazil, or any of the other emerging markets in Southeast Asia. But also the application of Springboard can extend to developed world companies. And I think this is what Yadong and Rosalie have done in the 2018 paper. So actual empirical testing of this perspective in the developed market, as well as more of the emerging market, would be very, very useful. We should move beyond the time to first CBA to rapidity of CBAs as a measure of Springboard internationalization. This is inherent in the theory. This has not been done so much in the empirical testing. We did the first CBA because the context of India needed that. But as all these countries are developing, or as more and more firms are actually coming out from such emerging markets, there is scope and room for using the rapidity of CBAs as a measure of Springboard internationalization. Furthermore, one can actually move beyond just CBAs, but include also other types of foreign direct investment in capturing Springboard internationalization, because the concept does not preclude other forms of foreign direct investment, although CBAs are clearly the most aggressive form through which resources and capabilities can be acquired. We can explore the challenges posed by Springboard internationalization on firms and what the mechanisms are through which firms can overcome these challenges. Future researchers should investigate the performance consequences of Springboard internationalization. It's all good to actually talk about how emerging market firms are doing this form of internationalization, but whether it helps them in terms of its baseline profits is another issue which can be analyzed. And finally, more fine-grained analysis of the industry characteristics such as technology intensity, global linkages, innovativeness on Springboard internationalization can be performed. So I would actually end here, pass it on back to Yadong.
You're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Vikas, for sharing really light on I think contextualizing Springboard perspective itself, but also I think I applaud in particular the way that your team through this paper showcasing how to design research by capturing the peculiarities and unique traits of emerging market and emerging market firms as well. The institutional change and business group affiliations, and together with their further interfaces with other firm level attributes are remarkable. We frequently ask ourselves for two things concurrently. One is to apply and test the theory, but on the other hand, to really contextualize our research design. So I think I really commend for your research design, particularly capturing institutional change. So thank you again, Vikas, and of course your co-authors. Our next speaker, Professor Doug Schuler, and his team published, I think, a very solid piece in JIPS in 2020 as well, taking a very unique and also fabulous perspective or angle, which probably JIPS or AIB field doesn't look at this thoroughly. That is the performance consequences of the speed of internationalization of emerging market firms. In this case, it's Chinese firms. In terms of regionalization patterns, how the speed of internationalization in one region or in different regions may lead to very different set of performance consequences. So it is interesting to see the departure from Vikas' paper, because both papers share the common ground of speed, but the underlying theoretical insights are just very distinctive and broadly complementary. Professor Schuler is the associate professor at the Rice Jones Graduate School of Business, and Doug has been, I think, committed also long enough to cooperate political strategies, or CPS, and also what is fascinating to me is his research also extends to public policies. His most recent research project pertains to organizational collaborations around food security or sustainability more broadly. So let's welcome Professor Doug Schuler.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm trying to get it to the slideshow, which we were able to do at the beginning, and I'm not able to do now. Bear with me 1 second. Can people see my slide or no?
You're on the last slide, so if you rewind back to using the left arrow, you should be able to.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Yadong, for that generous introduction. Welcome to all the guests we have, and thank you to Klaus. We're delighted to be here, and I'm humbled to actually present here with the other authors, and really to represent my team, because my team does have young scholars. It is sadly not me anymore, but Hee-Chun Kim is the lead author of this study. He's actually in the audience tonight from University of Calgary. And Ji Wu from University of Macau is also a young scholar. And myself and Bob Hoskison, who just retired, but he never really retires, if anyone knows him, from Rice University. So I'm going to be presenting this paper. And I think this quote is quite good for us. So today there's no first world, second world, or third world, just the fast world and the slow world. So this paper, which I'll talk to you about in the next 10 minutes here, is really about speed and distance, and speed and proximity. And does speed and proximity somehow relate to performance? And if so, kind of how does it work? And can kind of attending to speed and proximity simultaneously solve some kind of paradoxes that are in the IB literature? So the first assertion is it's unclear how a firm's international speed, and by the way, international speed, we're thinking about the average pace at which a multinational builds a network of subsidiaries once it's established its first. That's what we're thinking about. So it's similar to the prior paper, because we're thinking about how quickly, what is the pace at which this international network is getting built. But we want to know, how does it relate to the financial performance of that multinational company? And furthermore, as I said, we want to think about how does it relate, or does it relate at all, to where those international investments are taking place? Would this relationship matter if these were taken closer to home or farther from home? So I'm going to jump into the framework, and in doing so, I'm going to kind of explain these various relationships. So looking at a set of Chinese multinational enterprises, what we really wanted to know were kind of two sets of factors. First of all, how does the pace at which they entered, combined with the place in which they enter, affect their financial performance? So our first set of hypotheses, which is really this relationship H1A, is kind of based on this logic, and it's spelled out in the paper, but I'll quickly go through it. And essentially what we argue is that although obviously rapid internationalization is costly for a firm, the marginal cost of rapid expansion closer to home within the region is less than farther away. Furthermore, the liability of foreignness, which the literature talks about a lot, may be less closer to home, because within the region, it's more likely that there's going to be some familiarity with customers and other type of things, including psychic distance. So that's setting up kind of this expectation that performance will be good for fast-paced intra-regional internationalization, On the flip side, farther away is going to be more difficult. Obviously, farther away internationalization gives you tremendous growth opportunities, but those opportunities come with risks, right? And there's a lot of risk administratively in terms of how do you stretch the organization rapidly farther away. There's a larger chance that the liability of foreignness plays out in these things. So it sets up our first set of hypotheses that we're gonna test. The second set of hypotheses really have to do with firm-specific assets, and that's the set of hypotheses that are on the bottom of this diagram related to technological and marketing resources. And so the arguments for technological and marketing resources contributing or affecting financial performance intraregionally really are tied into the familiarity, the fit, and the administrative heritage that created marketing resources, that create technological resources more likely to manifest when those investments, when those are brought into nearby region, as opposed to farther away and more distant region. So essentially, our sets of hypotheses that are about are essentially the shorthand is that we argue that technological and marketing resources, FSAs, are going to manifest better within the region. So our study was a set of 767 Chinese listed multinationals. They were listed in Shanghai and Shenzhen Stock Exchange. It's a panel data, so it's over a 12-year period from 2002 until 2014, and financial multinationals were excluded. So a very quick picture, a very quick recounting of the results are that you can see that if we look at speed alone, what we see is that firms exhibited stronger performance in the next period as measured by ROA when that was done close close to the home region, and it was negatively related to far away to investments far away. And it didn't matter. I'm not gonna get into the details, but for both intra-regional and interregional, we consider kind of subvariants of different definitions and different variants of the market, but the results stay stable. The second set of hypotheses had to do with technological resources, which were industry adjusted R&D expenditures. And again, what we found that if these were deployed interregionally, they were positively associated with performance, but when they were deployed farther away, at least farther away into emerging markets, it was negatively related to performance. It was non-significant in developed markets, and we found the same relationship with marketing resources. So industry adjusted marketing expenditures were positively related to interregional investment, and they were negatively related to farther investment. What are some of the implications of this empirical work that we did? Well, one of them, we believe, is it highlights the importance of a requisite fit between the speed and geographic space of foreign expansion. Second, we believe it validates the descriptive and prescriptive value of the Uppsala model. Obviously, as people on this conference know, a very old view of international expansion, one which talks about the benefits of going slowly, and many of those things were shown in these data. It disconfirmed to some extent the universal value of firm-specific advantages. So we show that there's variance in when FSAs create value for the company. There's managerial implications to compete in advanced economies. Speed matters, but really I think it means start by I would say being close, right? Start by being close to where you're starting from when it comes to developing technological and marketing resources. Be patient and be persistent, and think think about deploying those close to the home market and interregionally as opposed to far away. This research is really just scratching the surface, we believe. We think there's many other questions that could be asked about speed and distance in relationship to performance. So obviously we have a single measure of performance in this study. So I think one of the key questions would be, what are the long-term performance effects? Do these interregional gains, which we show, do they dissipate over time? Do interregional losses dissipate over time? One might think that some of this could be a function of learning, which might be more difficult interregionally. Is there an ideal sequencing of these fast internationalization moves? I think the paper before us was very interesting in talking about a build out, and our paper kind of doesn't really break that into bits, but could interregional short-term gains be used to offset interregional losses as you build a global network? And I think that would be a very interesting area of future research. And then what determines firms' international speed, right? Are there desires to create foreign networks, home networks, both? So in any case, this is our study, and we're very glad to be here. And Hee-chan is also here tonight, so he will help me with some of the questions about this study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. I learned a lot from this piece, which I can summarize into 3 S: speed, space, and skills. When we revisit Springboard perspective, for example, we have to be cautious in a sense that new MNE theories are not a total departure of our mainstream MNE theories. And your piece and your team, I think, have put cohesively those 3 S: speed, space, and skills. And in particular, the interface between space and speed, and the interface among skills, in your case, technological capabilities and marketing capabilities, into the interactions between speed and space. So that is a great, I think, lesson. Our audience could learn from the, again, research design. From theoretical perspective, I think on the one hand, this piece is creative, but yet the design allows you to reconnect the new contextualization, but also with some of the fundamental MNE theories, such as competencies, and such as the regionalization. For that, I think I like to underscore a great, I think the contribution you made. I think secondly, the differentiation between intra and inter-regional strategy is truly a merit to appreciate, because underlying this difference between intra and inter has a lot to do with, I think, not only culture, proximity, but even geopolitical, even economic ties, even diplomatic ties. So I think even though your study does not directly tackle these second order, third order dimensions behind intra and inter-regional, but that differentiation between intra and inter is certainly a very enlightening direction for, I think, the IB scholars, whether, again, young or old, to follow up. I think the political complexity today probably reminds us even more, not less, about the necessity to look at differentiation between intra and inter-regional strategies. That is a great, I think, the even future agenda to further explore. Thank you again, Doug, and your team. Our third speaker is Professor Peter Lee, also on behalf his very strong team as well. This is probably even the most latest development of knowledge on emerging market firms, and including the Springboard perspective. This is the, I think, the kind of eye-opening in a sense that it is the first piece, to my knowledge, that really integrates innovatively between two formally separated theoretical lenses to look at the emerging market firms or growth of emerging market firms, namely composition-based view, which look at the performance of emerging market firms in general, regardless of internationalization or not, and then Springboard view, which gears more toward globalization. So the Peter's team really put together in an innovative way, and I leave Peter to further introduce. Peter, obviously, I think to many of us, it's really long, dedicated, and a prolific and impactful scholar. Peter is a chair professor. I think that to be more precise, Peter is Lee Da-Seng Chair Professor of International Business at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. I personally read and certainly learned quite sizably from Peter's multi-decades works, particularly in two lines worth highlighting. One is the multinational firms from emerging economies, and Peter's second line, or equally a strong, I think the contribution is indigenous research. Indigenous research on emerging market firms and the Chinese businesses, Chinese management, Chinese culture, or combination of all three. And so for those of people in the audience who want to see conceptualization of indigenous research or indigenous firms and indigenous culture, I think that Peter's work is remarkable. Now, Peter, please.
Thank you very much. So let me share my screen. Okay. Sorry. Sorry for my misplaced slides. Okay, I'll start from here. I'm very happy to share with you our research. Our team is of 4 co-authors, myself and Xiaoming and Stephen and AIB, and the 3 the young scholars, actually the last 2, but they were already team working together. Okay, so let me. What is really we want to have this research questions is really about, is there a link between CBV, basically compositional based view, and springboarding perspective? And so what are the underlying theme for integrating the 2 logics towards a new perspective, combined perspective? We call that compositional springboarding view. So we need first introduce, because in the IB field, probably many of us do not know so much about the compositional based view. So composition based view is really different from the resource based view, in a sense that the resource based view focuses more on the varying resources. Okay, but the compositional based view more focus on the regular resources, those resources that are market available and you can buy from the external market. And particularly the importance of a composition-based view is about its unique combination. Unique combination, unique mix of all resources in such a way that they can gain competitive advantages. Basically, this theory explains how the emerging markets, multinationals, accumulate its capabilities and in the initial kind of stage of its growth, and before they even spring out into the international markets. So once you get into the springboarding perspective, you will see that the 3 capabilities are very important: amalgamation, ambidexterity, and adaptation. And of course, I don't go beyond too much of this. I don't read it out, but you can probably know that if you're familiar with Yadong's work, you know that amalgamation is basically ability to combine all available resources together. Then ambidexterity is really about the ability to simultaneously fulfill 2 different or conflicting goals. Okay, so that's really about ambidexterity. Adaptation is respond to the dynamic competitive environment, especially nowadays under the VUCA conditions. I think it's become more and more important. Then you have the 5 stages of the upward spiral. Okay, start with the inward FDI, then we have a radical outbound FDI, then we have a capability transfer from overseas accumulated capability back home, then we have a home-centered, home-specific upgrading of its home base, then the last stage, this global outreach. Okay, basically that is really the later stage of the springboarding. Okay. Then if we go to the detail, we'll find that the stage 1 and 2 are somewhat very much related. They're part of the FDI stages, but one is more about inbound, one is more about outbound. Then transfer, basically transfer of those acquired key resources back home from abroad. And this is somewhat related to the first paper in the sense that the merger acquisition, especially merger acquisition in more advanced countries, will be the most relevant. And that's probably the underlying reason for the emerging multinational to go overseas. And so here, I really want to highlight what really the existing theories are very insufficient to explain is that the so-called reverse, M&A reverse FDI would be the most relevant. That if the emerging multinationals investment in less developed countries, that's totally different. That can be explained by existing paradigms. But the reverse ones is most interesting, most challenging. And springboarding is about that reverse side. Then we have the number 4, basically falsify the home base. And then number 5, basically try to strengthen the home base and really try to become a global player. And here is really our main argument, that the two logics, the two theories used to be separate. One explains how the emerging multinationals develop at home, and one is about how they springboard overseas. And we see that actually the two logics actually are very much intertwined. They are very much relevant. They're highly complementary. So we see that there is a possibility we can combine the two. And we particularly argue that the composition-based view logic is very much relevant for the stages 1 and 4. The first one is inward FDI. Number 4 is really about the home-centered upgrading. So I think that so the CBV is very much related to the stage 1 and 4, and the springboarding view is it's very much related to the number 2 outbound FDI and also transfer. And so then we also think that number 5, stage 5, would be a true combination of the the composition-based view and the springboard view, and we also try to evoke the relatively new perspective in terms of resource orchestration, resource management. That we basically borrow that concept, borrow that perspective to argue that the capability assembly and the capability application are the very core of the resource orchestration. And then capability assembly are more relevant, is relevant at the more relevant at stage 1 and 2. And then capability application is more relevant at the stage 3 and 4. Then the stage 5, both of them are in play. So here is really how we visualize the connection between the two logics, and also the resource orchestration, the capability assembly, capability leverage. Then also we basically link all of them into this the stage model, stage 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And we use different kind of emphasis, different highlights, different focuses. So at the stage 1, we see that it's more about assembly and ordinary resources for amalgamation, for the ambidexterity and for adaptation, but they focus on one side of it. Then stage 2 is also about assembly, but then they had the entry of the resource-based view, the Variance resources for amalgamation. Then they focus the shift from usefulness for the ambidexterity to novelty. Then for the adaptation, there was also a shift from a minor unlearning to radical unlearning, because they have to give up many of their accumulated experience at home and try to really learn the new things. And so they have to get rid of their inertia, try to expand into the new domain, new arena. Then at the stage 3 and 4, they're more into the resource application. And so it's not a acquisition, it's not accumulation, it's not asset seeking. It's more about utilization and how to utilize it. Okay, and so then we also find that the stage 3 is more related to resource-based view with the varying resources for amalgamation, novelty, and radicalness. But then at stage 4, they have to revisit, coming back to the ordinary resources and usefulness, and also minor unlearning. So it's a kind of a really spiral. They're going out and then come back. And so that's really our kind of a projection. Then the stage 5 is a balancing of both resource assembly and resource leverage, the application. And so that the ordinary and the varying resources for amalgamation, usefulness and the novelty for ambidexterity, and the radical and minor unlearning for adaptation. And of course, there was a future balancing that the further balancing between the two logics and two theories. And so we come to our kind of final slides. for the future implications. I think the two logics integration really constitute a meta duality. And so they can define a meta capability of emerging multinationals. And they really can add and enrich the resource orchestration. And so we need to enrich further the three capabilities: amalgamation, ambiguity, adaptation. We can also enrich the 5 stages, okay, particularly combine the two. Then the last slide I want to share is our new thinking. Because springboarding is more about the kind of latecomers, the Chinese or Indian or emerging multinational coming from behind or just try to catch up. But this is not the only trajectory. We can see some of the cases there now, they have a new generation of emerging multinationals. They somewhat like born global. For example, the Chinese company, ByteDance. ByteDance had this TikTok, this phenomena. This is really extending beyond the springboarding, because they somewhat start at the same point. The same starting point is the same, start line the same with the advanced multinationals. So these are the companies more and more in China. We need to look at those who had a very sophisticated technologies, the very sophisticated know-how. They start on the screen and on the old scene, and then compete against the established multinationals with equal capabilities, and sometimes even more competitive advantages in terms of agility and flexibility. So those are the things in the future. So somehow we can connect that one with the springboard, with the composition-based view. So I think it's probably we'll get into a new stage where some of the newly emerging multinational companies will represent the really third type in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, again, for sharing your latest knowledge and your thoughts. I think this is the wonderful piece in broadening and prolonging the time horizon of not just the springboard view, but broadening the horizon of the evolutionary growth of emerging market firms in general. You look at these stages, you integrate the strategic priorities in terms of what kind of compositional strategies, advantages to be leveraged by these emerging firms in different stages along so-called upward spiral phases. It's really, again, a nice theoretical piece and exhibiting, combining two related but seemingly unattended logics on emerging market firms. So like other two pieces, I again applaud to your piece as well. As Klaus mentioned at the outset, while we express our gratitude to all the speakers and their teams, we are also the opening up to questions and hoping to get further insights from our speakers. The first two related questions are, I think, probably alluded more to Vikas and your team. This is the question, or a pair of two questions. One is, to which countries your sample firms springboard to? And second, has Springboard in your case, the first CBA speed. Does that Springboard Act lead to success or not for Indian firms? Vikas.
So thanks a lot. I think while it is quite easy to assume that a lot of Indian firms, as well as emerging market firms, springboard to the developed firms in search for technology, in search for some key resources, that is not what we actually find in the data set that we are working with. In fact, it is actually varied. So to answer the question of where they're springboarding to, it is actually all over the place. So it is including the developed as well as the developing markets, so the emerging markets. And I think the kind of resources that some of these Indian firms, and I would imagine other emerging market firms, are looking for are not entirely the same as what we tend to think is, which is a piece of technology which is, say, developed in the developed world. It could be something else. It could be a variation of the technology, which may be more relevant to a particular high growth emerging market, and that might be available in a less developed or an emerging market. So I can't answer you the exact countries where they're actually springboarding to, but I also wrote in the chat box at one point in time that it's all over the place. I have a couple of examples which shows that they actually rapidly internationalize into many markets, which included both developed and developing markets. The answer to the second question, unfortunately, is something that I can't actually tell because we never did that analysis. Whether it's leading to, I think the question was whether it's helping them, whether it's helping them in increasing their global competitiveness or profitability. I think it is too early to tell. There has to be more research. There has to be more firms actually entering into more of these markets. Anecdotally, I would think that yes, it is actually improving their global competitiveness by just the sheer fact that they are present there. They're much better known. It would allow them to actually do more business. It would allow foreign enterprises to actually do business with them and enhance their overall learning. So in that sense, yes, they are on a path of actually becoming more globally competitive. But specifically speaking, I have less of an idea about whether it's improving their final profitability. I think this is something which relates to Doug's paper because they really looked into the performance.
And thank you, Vikas. That's exactly you directed that question now to Doug. Let me probably further enlarge that question a little bit to Doug. And I think your empirical piece, I think the emphasis is more toward financial dimension of the performance. Any reasons that whether due to data or originating from your design purposely, that you didn't look at the non-financial aspect or aspects of performance?
Yeah, if I may, is there any way? So thank you for the question. Is there any way of getting Hee-chan into the audio? I know he's out there.
Let me work on it.
Hee-chan, welcome.
Thanks. Yes, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry about that.
The question is why we really appreciate your contribution to the financial consequences of the speed and the space. Are there any reasons that you didn't look at the, for example, market performance, competitive performance, or what we generally call non-financial? Any purpose behind?
I think it's for comparison reasons, because there are a couple of previous studies that look at the relation between speed and performance, and they typically use the financial performance. So we wanted to illustrate, because prior research, in fact, didn't reveal the effect of speed on performance. So by using a similar dependent variable, we wanted to show, because the space part is missing in prior research. So as we add distance, the issue, the mixed result from previous research can be sorted out. So that's why we decided to focus on just the financial aspect of the outcomes.
And thank you, Hu Chang. Sometimes I noticed that like some of our speakers also noted, emerging market firms do vary in their strategic motives behind going global. And so I think the defining success from internationalization, I think is related to what motives are behind. So I think that is something probably will be a good, one of the potential topics for the future, to look at the configuration of motives. If the motives has more to do with, for example, market share or foothold, then some of the non-financial yardsticks would be relevant too. I appreciate, I hope I appreciate more than enough proportionally about the fascinating space and skills and speed. But recently, I noticed potential interesting, probably extension from your current study, is the definition of region itself. I know that your study look at the for example, whether it is Asian Pacific from Chinese perspective, which again makes perfect sense. But I think in coming years, the definition of region lies more, not necessarily pure geographical sense, but more geo-economic and geopolitical sense. In particular, I think the treaties, TPP, for example, and some of the, for example, even, for example, Chile and Peru are members of some of the treaties which embodied or encompass most Asian or major players economically of the region. So do you, what is your take on this recent development of redefining the definition of a region, particularly in a sense of the bilateral treaties, and certainly China and the US in particular are two leading powerhouses in building their own multilateral, I think, blocks, and TPP certainly, I think, illustrates that. I just wish to hear your thoughts.
I think that question may also need to direct to Alan Vicky, who in fact made a contribution to this particular topic. But when I look at the recent phenomenon, especially when you look at some conflict between the US and China, obviously the period we observed the Chinese internationalization is quite different from what we observe nowadays, especially as you mentioned, some political issues has a huge impact on the company performance, especially those from China. For example, Huawei is a good example. I mean, maybe 10 years ago, Huawei was kind of emerging and strong multinational, but nowadays, all of a sudden, because of political issue, they are kind of struggling. At the same time, in terms of the boundary, how we define inter versus interregional, of course, can impact the outcome. So we kind of apply the existing theoretical perspective on inter versus interregional arguments. But as you mentioned, as we redefine inter versus interregional markets by using different perspective, obviously we can gain much further insight about our understanding of emerging markets multinationals' performance.
Sure. Thank you, Hui-Ching, again.
And Yadong?
Sure, Doug, please.
Yeah, if I could come in very quickly. So thank you, of course, to Sean for that. One thing I did note when you were making your comments were, of course, I'm quite keen on public policy. And I think essentially, if you think about FSAs, I mean, this is precisely what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to essentially minimize administrative space. So they're not minimizing physical space, but of course, what they're attempting to do is create a marketplace for a company in which the political barriers, those administrative barriers, essentially don't exist, right? We know that's the ideal. You know, you tear up the tariff book, so it just says zero. And so then it just becomes a managerial decision about whether you would be in that market for market reasons. So I think it's a very good point you bring up. And, you know, again, I just finished teaching my little half semester trade policy course, and the end was really talking precisely about small emerging market countries and whether they should be pursuing these type of FTAs and being part of WTO because of these purported benefits. So anyway, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for sharing extra insights. Peter, very, I think, the straightforward question to your team is, do you, or to what extent you think compositional springboard logic can apply well to other emerging market firms? So in other words, can we generalize a little bit?
I think so. I think that we need to explain where the emerging market multinationals accumulate or develop its initial capabilities in the first place. That so they must have something done at home before they go abroad. And only those born global who are different, who really had a capability.
Peter?
It seems the connection to Shanghai is cut off. Shall I move on with the question for Ajay and then get back to?
Sure. Oh, sure. I noticed, I think Dr. Ajay Gore is with us as well. Back to, I think probably this is the question to all our speakers. So this is open queue to anyone, any speaker you like to answer. I think the Hui-Ching just alluded to briefly. That is the complexity of globalization in retreat, or complexity of geopolitics, along with, again, pandemic and a global economic slowdown, does impose way more new challenges, let alone old challenges. Now they face tons of new challenges. So with those new challenges in mind, some people I heard, some people told me that the best time for emerging market firms' growth or internationalization might have been gone. So certainly those newly imposed challenges have compelled us, and to some degree rethink both mainstream theories and also emerging market MNE theories. So in light of your latest research and cutting edge studies, do you have any, or have you put some thoughts how your papers you presented today could actually give us some of the answers to these new challenges they face? And Peter, you can join us, and we will invite you to answer the original question a little bit momentarily, but this is the general question to all our three stellar speakers, along with co-authors like HR.
So if I can share my thinking on this, I think there are two issues here. One is the capability of these emerging market multinationals to compete in the global marketplace. And the second is the additional challenges which will be potentially imposed because of the new geopolitical situation, so to say. Now, when it comes to the first aspect, I would argue that these emerging market multinationals would actually be even more competitive in the coming years. I mean, we have seen that historically also. If you close the borders, if you make things difficult for these firms did not start from a position of strength. So the whole idea of a Springboard perspective itself was to find innovative ways to develop capabilities. And these firms will therefore, then find some alternate ways to become even more competitive in the international landscape. I mean, they have all of the things that they had in the past which made them successful, whether we are talking of the institutional framework or, labor advantages and so on. Now, coming to the second aspect, which is the political constraints which are imposed, it's really an evolving situation. And it would be interesting to see if, developed markets, I mean, some people argue that deglobalization is actually really not deglobalization, it is de-Chinization or re-Westernization, depending on how we really look at it. So if it is de-Chinization, then, one could argue that there are actually greater opportunities for firms from other parts of the world, India and so on. Not to say that the opportunities for Chinese firms will diminish, they would emerge in some other space as well. But I think it's too early to argue and think that the Western world and Western corporations can operate in isolation. I mean, the way global value chains are integrated, I think we'll very quickly revert back to the previous situation in which we were. So I'm not too pessimistic about,
Yeah, thank you, HR. I think, yes, I think that's, I want to echo your view that the geopolitics does, I think, the benefit some of the non-Chinese EMEs more than those from China. And certainly this could create even more variance among those different origin or different home country emerging market firms. And that variance certainly, I think, leads to or result in more opportunities for some of, again, people today to look at further. Peter, are you with us now? Peter? I guess that's fine. The very final question, and before I share some of my final thoughts, again, together with Klaus, he might also have the final concluding remark as well, is the issue about the post-internationalization, post-Springboard, the strategies. When we revisit some of the current EME theories, obviously we know much better theoretically concerning the motives, the unique motives, unique the weaknesses and unique trajectories to enter, and to where to enter, and ways by which to enter. And Peter touched briefly on those stage 3, stage 4, and stage 5, which is really fascinating. But I like to hear the other speakers' thoughts and the co-authors' thoughts as well as to what are some of the new IB research streams, research the directions you personally foresee in terms of post-Springboard, the strategies, acts, performance, and or broadly processes after the Springboard.
I think I'll just quickly make my point. I think the role of state is very critical, very important, but I also think that it is a little bit over-exaggerated. I think businesses would continue to actually springboard. Businesses would continue to function to a large extent, also independent of the policy that is actually shaping and what is actually not only shaping the real business world, but also our minds. So this is something which I would think would be a very interesting area to explore and investigate.
Peter?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I'm back now. All right. Okay, so my view is right. I think that the current globalization, the main forces are still in place, but I think that we can learn from 2 lessons from this pandemic. And I think one is really, we have to understand that probably geographically, we need to diversify somewhat. We cannot afford to concentrate everything in one place, one country, one region. And also the just-in-time system is really as a second issue. Just-time, as an example, it's been questioned. We need to build a more kind of a loosely coupled kind of system rather than tightly coupled. That we need to have some buffers, we need to have some room to have some flexibility. But even currently with the shipping disruption, okay, transportation disruption, supply chain disruption, is really another indication that the past globalization is not really on a sustainable base. There's something need to be revisited. But the overall trend for globalization will continue, but in a probably different form, different format. And of course, the China issue is very important, geopolitical issues. But I don't think that de-Chinaization would be all over the place. Will be in probably more concentrated in the area which is a politically sensitive, technology sensitive. But for the ordinary traditional industries, I think that's the same business as usual. It will be the same. And then somewhere in between is questionable. So which one will be sensitive to the disruption, or which part will be a totally controlled band? We don't know. And I think that need to be pursued in the future. And I think it's a very important topic.
You brought in so-called global posture. I think all emerging market firms will re-look at the global posture. You mentioned the diversification. I think certainly this is even more noteworthy to redefine global posture for Chinese firms. Great, thank you, Peter. Doug, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with these final thoughts. I mean, you know, one, and I don't know Hee-chung's views. I mean, I think that the fact that we studied Chinese firms is special. It always makes me wonder about the generalization of the findings, because again, the role of the state is just so extraordinary in China. And the capability of the state versus, I think, everywhere else in the world. But I kind of concur with these thoughts that I think there's going to be continued expansion by emerging market multinationals. There's a lot of pressure, like we said, on supply chains to diversify, find alternative suppliers, and I actually think that there's going to be, I guess I'm optimistic that there's going to be actually an expansion of foreign expansion from emerging market multinationals outside of China.
Thank you, Doug. Again, I know Klaus is reminding me about time. Let me thank all speakers again for not only sharing your latest cutting-edge knowledge, but also sharing the answers to some of the key questions we're all concerned with. It's very fruitful. I have to say, it's a very fruitful learning journey for me, and I hope it's also for our global audience. I maybe can take another 1 minute or two to share what I'm hoping our IB scholarship to continue our research journey on emerging market MNEs. I summarized those issues into so-called 8 perspectives, and for the time's sake, should be very brief. The first perspective is a perspective of variance. We mentioned this repetitively today. And so typology is one solution to deepen our understanding of different types of emerging market firms, even within the same home country. So that is the variance perspective. The second perspective for our future work is what I see as evolutionary perspective. Peter's work, I think, gave us good insight into the direction, 5 stages, upward spiral, for example. So this is evolutionary perspective. And in particular, as I mentioned, it is the issue of from stage 3 to stage 5, from capability transfer to home-based augmentation, capability augmentation, and then global re-takeoff, global re-catapult. Now, those 3 stages actually I suspect, will take longer. But I think the IB scholarship does not adequately look at these stage 3 to stage 5 issues. So evolution. Third is the comparison perspective. I understand that our teams, we do have data limitation, but good news is I think we do have more data availability, allowing us to compare different home country emerging market firms. So I think the comparing BRICS, comparing, for example, the Mexico multinationals vis-a-vis even Brazilian multinationals, certainly I think it's very plausible. And that comparative perspective, I think is very warranted. The third perspective is what I call a linkage perspective. And for that linkage, I refer particularly to the post-Springboard foreign operations, whether value chain or global R&D, to home-based capabilities, whether production or other supporting activities. So that home and host linkage, and even third country role in facilitating that linkage is something relatively limited in the current state of knowledge. The fifth direction or perspective is reorganizing perspective. We just mentioned the global posture. And certainly the Springboard view does not mention, deeply enough about reorganizing, restructuring. For example, more firms today from large emerging market firms started to be more proactive in spinning off their subsidiaries, especially in developed countries. Now, there are a lot of strategic reasons behind this type of reorganizing and restructuring, in part to cope with geopolitics, for example. So reorganizing perspective would be, I think, very essential and very needed. The sixth perspective is a contextualizing or contextual perspective. The first piece Vikas and his team shared was a great example of contextualizing. We also, in Q&A, we mentioned the state ownership as well, but there are more even contextualized variables. So when you look at the, for example, composition-based view, and certainly there are many contextualized strategies whether tactical actions or strategic actions behind. So I think the current theories actually do have those concepts behind, but I think we need to empirically, I think quantify those. The seventh perspective, or as a new direction, is a subsidiary springboard perspective, or we might call second level springboard perspective. That is, so far, we only prioritize our view toward the parent corporate offices. But what if some of these firms, again, Ajar mentioned Huawei, for example, they may not use their Shenzhen headquarters as a home to design those springboard strategies. Instead, they may ask their flagship subsidiary in Canada as a springboard and anchoring base. Now that in part can minimize the exposure to geopolitics. And certainly that subsidiary anchored springboard is something I need to look at, I need to learn, and I hope I can learn from the colleagues as well. The last perspective is obviously is a capability perspective. I think all three speakers today have mentioned and even captured in different forms about those capabilities. And obviously we have numerous capability-based theories. And I still believe those current mainstream capability-based views, whether knowledge-based, RBV and dynamic capabilities and others, I think they still shed a lot of light on emerging market companies' competence. And at the end of the day, those new capability building, augmentation of current capabilities while developing new capabilities, or again, as Peter mentioned, ambidextrously co-fulfill, co-develop all these two kinds, is something I think it is the bottleneck for many emerging market firms today. And that bottleneck has to be addressed, regardless of the theory we use. And Klaus raised an excellent question as the theme today: how to win competition for these firms to compete, particularly in developed countries. And for that key question, the capability is certainly, perhaps certainly amongst the most fundamental questions for us, for practitioners, executives, and even for policy makers. So with that, let me pass over to Klaus.
Thank you, Yadong, for your profound insights in terms of you're laying out research agendas for, I think, 8 PhD theses, if I counted correctly. For me, I think that 2 themes that I keep popping up in the discussions. So my first one is the link between strategy and performance. And between strategy and performance, there's something called strategy implementation. Because this Springboard idea, when I was back in China, I heard this idea, they used different words because they hadn't read your paper, right? But the idea popped up a lot of time when you talk to Chinese entrepreneurs, but are they actually able to implement it, right? In your paper, you talk about success factors, but not everybody who pursues it is successful. And why that is the case has to do with the things you were just talking about, capabilities. And the second theme is, can we still study emerging economy multinationals using a sort of strategy lens, whether that's the internationalization process model, Springboard perspective, or other strategic management literature? Or do we have to incorporate the political variables? And if so, how do we bring the political variables into the frameworks from strategic management, integrating those perspectives. And going forward, especially for Chinese companies, that seems to be necessary. For Indian companies, Ajay made an interesting comments. Maybe it actually works in favor of Indian companies, right? But those are the, I think, my agendas, which I think is not another 2 PhD projects, because it actually overlaps with what Yadong was talking about, just giving a slightly different angle. So thank you very much, Yadong. Thank you for all the speakers and the panelists who were in the audience when we brought in. Thank you for your insights. We will be back with further seminars very soon. We have another one scheduled for October 28. We will talking about energy transition. How do multinational enterprises engage with policies aimed at promoting green energies? So you may recall there was a special issue recently published on that topic. And on November 16, we will talk about global value chains, again, a topic of particular relevance to emerging markets. The perspective will be on the host countries, and the papers come from a special issue in the Journal of International Business Policy. So thank you very much, everyone, for your contribution, and see you soon at one of our future webinars.
Thank you all.